Hello, I'm Tracy Nicholas, and welcome to Folkloring. I am a passionate folklore practitioner, and to me, folkloring is more than just a podcast. It's my commitment to help you connect with your roots and awaken the wisdom within you. Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Folkloring, in which I talk with Neil Byrne, the creator of Fey Earth. And we'll get into all of those details in a minute. You'll find out what that's all about. I just wanted to jump on and let you know that we had a little bit of a connectivity issue, and about 30 minutes in, there's a little bit of a problem with the sound, in which it sounds a bit gravelly from Neil's end. We tried everything we could. I tried cleaning up the audio. We got off the call and started a new one. We just couldn't seem to fix it, but the conversation was great, and I didn't want to let all of that good sharing go. So sorry for the audio problems. I hope that it's not too disruptive, and I hope that you're still able to enjoy this episode. Thanks so much. Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Folkloring. And today we are going to be talking with Neil Byrne, who is a tabletop role-playing game designer for over 10 years, and he is the creator of Fey Earth. And we're going to talk all about that in just a minute. But before we start, welcome, Neil. Glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Yes. Have you been doing any folkloring lately? And if so, what?
Yes, so I've recently been focusing my research on Russian folklore, specifically relating to the Baba Yaga, because of a really fun idea I have for a short mini campaign series I want to record sometime in the summer that is inspired by the Marvel TV series Agatha along the way.
Mhm.
And the idea is it'll be a party of players who are all playing witches who will be going on a magical journey of discovery and introspection, which, if they survive, they will find themselves facing the Baba Yaga.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
I love.
So, so the book I just finished is called Baba Yaga, the Wild Witch of the Eastern Russian Fairy Tales, with introductions and translations by Sibylline Forrester. And now I've just started on Morphology of the Folk Tale by Prop. So yeah, and then when I finish those, I'll be going back to another book I'd been reading, Russian folk tales by, I'm gonna butcher this pronunciation, Afezniev, I think. I'm sorry. He was the foremost figure in Russian folklore, collecting works in the mid 19th century. He like think Brothers Grimm times 100.
Okay.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah. So this is all because I've been trying to get more and more good source material, not so much on Slavic folklore, but and Eastern European folklore, but specifically on the figure of the Baba Yaga.
Mhm.
So that's like, I mean, the collection of folktales isn't just on her; it's a whole host of folktales, of the different types. Your miraculous and magical, your animal tales, your fables, all of what you would expect in a collection of folktales. But it does include obviously some stories of that figure as well.
Mhm.
So yeah.
Well, it sounds like interesting research, and I love Baba Yaga.
Mm.
Yeah, one of my favorite all-time folklore characters. So that sounds like it's going to be really cool. Okay, so why don't you start us off by telling us a little bit about yourself and your path that got you to be where you're a game creator and why you're choosing the kinds of subjects that you're choosing.
Well, my day job has virtually nothing to do with tabletop role-playing games. I am a secondary school teacher. Specifically, I teach maths and the sciences with an emphasis on biology. So the only way that links to games is when it comes to the maths and the mechanics of a game, I'm really good at that. and actually will understand it way better than the average person because I understand statistics and probability. So I'll understand the expected normal distributions of a pool of D6s versus a single D20. So yeah, but I suppose in terms of game design, a brief biop of me would be that I started into tabletop role-playing games in the 90s. I'm very old, I'm in my 40s. So playing second edition Dungeons and Dragons, and I played that for, oh God, about 6 or 7 years until I was about 15. And then I decided to give up playing gaming entirely because I'd found that found myself Dungeons and Dragons, I had virtually nothing in common with my peers. Like we talk about rugby and that was it. I had nothing in common with my classmates and my peers because I had this one obsessive and all-consuming singular hobby. So I was like, shit, I need more interests.
Yeah.
So I just completely stopped gaming for 20 years.
Wow.
All right. Yeah, yeah. So for until I was in my mid 30s. And I was in my mid 30s and suddenly realized I didn't have any friends or a social life anymore, simply because life got in the way.
Sure.
You know, people get married, people get jobs, they move, they have to move towns and cities. And just like, you know, the
Yeah.
shit that is life gets in the
Right.
way of being able to live and spend time with your friends. That was literally it, you know. It wasn't like I was having all these massive falling out with people. Like, but no, we literally just got older and we had responsibilities.
Hmm.
So I was like, I need to start connecting with people again, like reform these friendships. And so I was like, I'd been watching on the internet on YouTube this really fun series being run by Will Wheaton of a tabletop role playing game, Titan's Grave, which I loved, and I got into it. Shortly after that, I got into Critical Role as well. I was like, I know I'm going to go back to gaming because, like, if you're running a tabletop role playing game, you and your friends are once a week, once a fortnight, once a month, whatever it is, but it's a regular scheduled activity, which unfortunately, when you hit your 30s, is often the only way you see your friends is we all sit down and we look at our calendars and we book in a date.
Right.
So
Right.
I got back into gaming and I was doing that for a few years. And then one day, I don't know where, this question popped into my head. What would the world look like if all of the creatures from folklore and fairy tale were real, had always been real, and lived alongside humanity? A singular question
Mm-hmm.
popped into my head, and it wouldn't go away. And after about 4 or 5 days, it was still bouncing around in my brain. I was like, okay, this is just, I have to turn this question into a game, into
Hmm.
something more than an idea. And that is essentially where Fey Earth came from.
Well, it's so interesting to me that when you were young, gaming was what was keeping you from having a social life. And then
Mm,
20 years later, it was offering you a social life. Um, and I find like I'm on a campaign right now. I'm in Vessen. We're playing Vessen.
oh
And
yeah.
yeah. And so it's like those are the people I talk to the most, you know?
Mm,
I mean, it's that group and the group that I talk to because we do ritual together. And like
mm,
that is my social life. And so,
yeah. Oh,
yeah, and I check in with a lot of the players like every day, you know?
mm,
Well, a
mm,
lot.
yeah.
There's only five of us on
Uh,
my team, but still. But yeah, that's really fascinating. And I tend to play folk horror. So
yeah.
yeah, and so but obviously the folklore characters appeal to me, and we're gonna get into talking about some of that. So let's talk about Fey Earth and what it's like, what the world is like.
So, well, if you play Vessen, it's similar to Vessen, although Vessen is, I know they've had expansions, but it essentially is a Nordic Scandinavian game. I
Mhm.
know that there are now expansions. They did an expansion in Britain and Ireland, and I think they've done a few other expansions, but certainly when it first came out, it was set in Scandinavia.
Mhm.
And it's folk horror
Right,
specifically.
right.
And also, from what I understand, I've watched some actual plays of Vessen, but I've never played it. That that the Vess and the Fey in it are, they're like hidden from humanity, like they exist and they live alongside humans, but most humans don't know that they're real and that they're there.
We're so what it's sort of set up like is we have it's like a society. It's a not
Yeah, yeah,
a
yeah, yeah,
society. So we know
yeah.
they're real because we're in the society.
But the average person,
Right.
yeah,
Right.
that's what I'm saying. The average person doesn't, unless you're a member of this secret society, that you're not going to be. Yeah. Whereas, in Fey Earth,
Hmm.
um, it's set in the 19th century, specifically the late 19th century, the 1870s. Okay, so very similar time period of Eisen. Um, it's it's an alternate history.
Right.
And what makes it an alternate history is that in the world of Fey Earth, all of the creatures from folklore and fairy tale are real, have always been real, and always lived openly alongside humanity. Okay,
Mhm.
always been there. Okay, and that magic is in the world as well, and some humans have magic because it's fairies and stuff. So that's the fundamental difference: is that the Fae have always openly lived alongside humanity and openly interacted with humanity, sometimes peacefully and sometimes through conflict. But
Mhm.
because of the presence of the Fae, then and because of the presence of magic, our histories have changed slightly,
Mhm. Mhm.
in certain ways. So it's not a horror-based game. I describe it more of urban fantasy.
Okay.
Because overwhelmingly I mean, okay, I don't know how other people would run it, but I've been in all the adventures that I've run of Fey Earth, and I've been in it for a few bloody years now. You're primarily in towns and cities, and then you'll go off maybe to explore a Fey mound or some sort of a magical site, and then you're back in the urban setting as well.
Uh-huh.
So
Uh-huh.
so it's that difference.
Well, it's interesting because I've only ever played folk horror games, and it's always seems like they like it starts out fairly normal, and then things start to get weird, and you have to kind of like figure your way through the weird stuff. And
Mm.
so, if everybody already knows what that all of these creatures are real, like that would be a premise sort of the games that I've played, of finding out that these creatures exist and then having to do something about it.
Mm.
But I wonder what are the stories like, that because if you don't have to do that, I don't have experience in that.
So I suppose the difference is, well, I mean, this is the other thing as well, is that when you're playing in Fey Earth, you're not always necessarily interacting with the Fey. I know a lot of the time the conflict might be with other humans, because humans are the original evil race, not orcs. So yeah, humans are assholes. So, but assuming that it is an interaction with the Fae, a lot of the time it's that the Fae have started doing something that they haven't done in ages, and you're trying to figure out, why are they doing this thing?
Mhm.
What has happened to trigger and cause this change in behavior or this effect?
Oh, okay. Very
you know
cool. Very cool.
so it could be that maybe a local factory owner has started polluting the river, and that's pissed off the Nixies.
Uh-huh.
Or maybe some farmers decided to chop down some trees, and they chopped down a few hawthorns they shouldn't have gone near. Or maybe the Fae got drunk and decided to be assholes. Like, it's not always that the humans have done something to anger the Fae. Sometimes it's just like, oh, a new Fae creature wandered into the area. Oh, cool. What kind of a Fae creature is it? It's a puka. Well, shit.
That's awesome. Um, so I know that there are other kinds of characters besides the Fae. You said it's like all of the sort of folklore, fairy tale kinds of creatures. What other kinds of creatures would I be interacting with if I were to play?
So in the game, I use the term Fae like mechanically and narratively as just a generic term for all magical non-human creatures.
Oh,
You
okay.
know,
Yeah.
so it's in my game, I've used that deliberately as a narrative device, as a
Mhm.
generic term for all magical creatures. But that's literally it. I mean, what makes Fey Earth ultimately unique is that when making this game, I've been working on this for a bleeding decade now, so I've been trying hard. I tried to depict the Fae, magical creatures in my game, as accurately and authentically as I can with folklore. And that's
Hold
ultimately
on a
what
second. You
Mhm.
cut out. You said I try to pick something like as accurately, and then you cut out.
I tried to depict the Fae as accurately and authentically as I could based on their descriptions in their original folklore.
Okay. So that's
And
what the
that
research into that.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
but that's ultimately what makes my game so unique. Because the reality is that if you open up my book, you will see a whole host of names that you're very familiar with of creatures that you've found in other games.
Hmm.
And I mean very, very well-known common names like goblin or kobold or elf or brownie.
Hmm.
But in Fey Earth, they're completely different to how they are described in most, if not nearly all other games.
Hmm.
Because the reality is, and Dungeons and Dragons is the bleeding worse for this, there's zero attempt at all to be authentic or respectful to the cultures that these creatures came from.
Hmm.
Gary Gygax basically got his hands on an encyclopedia of European folklore sometime in the 70s and effectively carried out cultural appropriation.
Ah,
That's what he did.
yeah.
He basically just took all of these names of all these creatures, thought they sounded cool, and put them into his game without at any point ever attempting to in any way respectfully depict these creatures based on how they appeared in the cultures that they came from. Whereas in Fey Earth, I've tried, and as much as I possibly could, to depict the Fae, all magical creatures, as authentically as I can, based on the stories that were told for centuries across Europe. The
Sure.
only limiting factor for me is the source material. How many stories are there about these creatures? How detailed are the stories? For, like one thing that I noticed very quickly that was very frustrating for me as a game designer is that in European folk tales and in fairy tales, the stories almost never physically describe the creature.
Mm.
It's terrible. It's unbelievably awful for how bad the stories are at physically describing the creature. Because when a grandmother used to tell this story to her kids at the fire 200 years ago and was talking about the Duergar or the elf or the Tatzelworm, okay, maybe not Tatzelworms, they're pretty well. No, this talking about the creature, well, the kids already knew what they looked like. You
Yes.
know, they already knew what a dwarf looked like. They already knew what a kabuto looked like. They already knew what a barghast looked like. So she didn't bother having to describe it. So that description isn't in the story.
Hmm. Hmm.
What I did find interesting is I found a friend of mine she's been living in Ireland since she's about 12, but she's originally from Zimbabwe. And we talked a lot about, Zimbabwean folklore and fairy tales. And in her own country, the descriptions of the magical creatures in their stories are much more vivid and much more descriptive. And we both talked about this, and they said that they felt that the reason why it's so much more descriptive is because the stories have stayed part of an oral tradition for so much longer than they did in Europe.
Right.
So because they were part of an oral tradition for longer and weren't written down until very recently, when you're constantly telling these stories to an audience of listeners, you're expected to tell a good story. So you
Right.
would include vibrant and evocative descriptions of the creatures, which is largely missing. Like in my research, one of the biggest challenges that I've actually had in my research is finding descriptions of creatures.
Hmm. That's really interesting because it's like when people started capturing these stories and writing them down, it did become sort of, this is the authority on
Hmm.
these stories. And so to not include that, I suppose it would be hard because when you read a lot of like original fairy tales, they they're nowhere near as sort of interesting and drawing you in as when you go to a storyteller who has to sort of paint the picture. And they all seem, not all, a lot of them seem to me to be like, this thing happened, and then this thing happened, and then this thing happened, and then they felt like this, and they did this. And it's just like a really sort of bland, straight ahead, here's the storyline. And it's not like even when you read fiction and the author creates a world for you to immerse yourself in. I just don't feel that way with a lot of those fairy tales, the Grimm, the Anderson.
I think one of the biggest differences, though, is that when you look at a folktale and a fairy tale, where they differ from especially modern fiction is that quite often the story that you were being told was more of a fable. It was something that was teaching a lesson,
Right,
often a moral lesson, not necessarily religious, but there was nearly always a lesson that was being told,
right.
either reinforcing societal and cultural norms
Mhm.
or passing on some societal and cultural tradition or traditional belief. So the story is as much, if not more, about the lesson behind the story
Sure.
as it is the contents of the story. And when you've been reading the books as long as I've been doing it, you find you do get to the point where you start to notice the patterns and you start seeing the messages that were behind the stories. And
Hmm.
and in doing so, gain a level of appreciation. Like one thing I do find interesting is, and is a lovely classic example, is that where you do get some better descriptions, it tends to be in very modern, and by modern I mean late Victorian, okay, like 1880s, that kind of thing, okay, because like that's basically the modern era anyway,
Yeah.
um especially if you live in a country like Ireland. But say a fairy, okay, fairies don't have wings.
Hmm.
They do not have wings.
Right,
The depiction of a fairy with wings is something that appeared in the late Victorian era in children's storybooks.
right,
That's where that comes from.
right.
If you read any story of any fairy from anywhere across Europe, all the way from Ireland to the Caucasus Mountains, I mean all of Europe, you never hear them described as having wings. They are normally simply described as being a human, looking like a human. Where you do get descriptions of them is often their clothing. They are nearly always described as wearing extremely vibrantly colorful clothing of rich reds and blues and greens, which to a modern reader might sound cool and fanciful, but the modern reader doesn't realize that you go back even 60, 70 years before the development of synthetic fibers like nylons, um, all clothes were shades of brown, black, and gray
Mm.
because dyeing clothing is really difficult when it's working with natural fibers and extremely expensive. And the only people in society who could wear incredibly richly dyed and colorful clothes were the wealthiest and most elite members of society, the nobles and even monarchs. That was it. No one else wore colored clothing because you literally could not afford the dyes that went into making your clothing bright. So in the stories, fairies are always described as having incredibly beautifully, richly dyed clothing.
Mm.
That's a reference to how wealthy they were in the eyes of a human.
Mm.
Most modern readers who don't understand the history of fabrics and clothing don't get that reference,
Mhm.
Um, whereas if you're a history nerd like me, you immediately pick up on the reference.
Got it. So how do you handle like, a lot of these different creatures have some like regional variations, right? So do you stick to like one kind or do you include all of these different, if it's the house spirits, right? And so do you include the different kinds of house spirits or do you just stick to one?
So when I was working on this is a great question. Is you're getting more into the game design side of things. So when I was doing research, I started creating stat blocks for these creatures, and you got to this. What I essentially decided to do was have a singular entry for them. So your house spirits, in the game I call them domestic fae, okay? And in the opening descriptions in the paragraphs, like literally in the opening line, I will have a list of all of the different names that you would get for this domestic fae creature, okay? Um, so using that. So for example, if you look up I have them Pixie, Pisky, Hobgoblin, Cadet, Foletois, Kobold, Heisemenken. That's the first line. Brownie is Scotland, Pixie is Cornwall, Pisky is, I think, Surrey, I think. Hobgoblin is Northern England. Cadet and the Cadet is French, as is the Foulettois. Then you have the Kobold, which was German, and the Heinzelmännchen was Swiss German. So these are all names for essentially what is an identical creature,
Mhm.
a very small, diminutive figure, usually no more than 20 or 30 centimeters in height, that would live in a home, although sometimes also maybe a brewery or a mill would help the family in return for being given offerings of food and or beer. Um, they all have essentially the same abilities. They're incredibly physically strong.
Mhm.
They are always invisible. Okay. They can they could give you a boon of luck, or they could curse you and hex you with misfortune. Um, in pretty much every single story of these domestic fae or house spirits, if you gave them the gift of an item of clothing, they would leave the home and never return. So we get the elves and the shoemaker story, okay? And where
Right.
the turf robbed it for the house elves in her book.
Yeah.
But yeah, and now in these examples, I do include some regional variation. So, for example, um, Irish and Scottish Fae specifically have vulnerability to iron.
Mhm.
This is something that everybody talking about fairies and fae and every piece of popular culture talks about how all the fae are vulnerable to iron. No, they fucking weren't. Literally, with the exception of singular examples of entity from singular stories,
Mhm.
the only regions across Europe where you see this widespread vulnerability to iron was in Ireland and Scotland exclusively. So going back to my description of my house spirit, my domestic fae, I do include in that if you're dealing with a creature from Ireland or Scotland, they are vulnerable to iron. But if they're from literally anywhere else in Europe, they're not.
Well, that's really interesting to me because it makes me think of sort of how people have, obviously different genetic,
Mm,
mutations, right? And so some people become diabetic and some people, have allergies or whatever it is. And so I think that it's very similar in that way. Like, of course, only Ireland and Scotland, which, you're right there, they developed this sensitivity, right,
mm,
for iron, and elsewhere they didn't. And who knows why, but that kind of thing happens over time and is passed down in genetic code. So I love that there can be those kind of really specific variations included
mm,
in the story, and it
mm.
makes sense.
Yeah. And what I did find interesting as well was that as I was doing my research and as I was writing up stat blocks for more creatures, realizing that I was actually worried about this one point that I was worried I was going to have actually only a very small number of creatures,
Mm.
distinctly unique creatures,
Uh-huh.
because I was finding so many examples of the same creature,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
which however, had a completely different name. I mean, another example you might have is the black dog or the Bargost, you know.
Right.
They're called, if you're in like north of England, Yorkshire, Northumberland, they're known as a Bargost. In Wales, the Gilagwa or Cín Anwen. In the Isle of Man, the Maud Duag. In Belgium, Chien Tien or the Oud Road again, also called the Black Shuck, you
Right.
know.
Right.
But in every single story, the description is the same. This massive, shaggy haired black dog, nearly the size of a bear, sometimes with chains draped across their back, often with glowing red eyes, a
Mhm.
harbinger or messenger of death. If you see them, it meant you or someone you knew was going to die. And in pretty much all the stories as well, they had this other ability whereby if you were injured by them, if they struck you,
Mhm.
the wound would not heal.
I thought there's also a black shuck that is protective, especially of travelers. And so if there's someone with evil intent out there and they're gonna, like you're walking at night and they're gonna attack you and rob you. Like sometimes the black shuck shows up and, goes and Padfoot, it was also Padfoot, right?
Yeah.
And walks along with the traveler until they're back somewhere safe.
That's yet again, it's still functioning in its capacity as a harbinger of death. It's
Mm,
still like they didn't. The thing with these creatures is they didn't kill you. They were warning you of harm to
Yeah.
come. So in this capacity where they're taking on a more overtly protective form, they are still functioning ultimately as a warning, a messenger of harm that may befall you, you know. But it's just, as I say, another example of like that's five, six different names for
Right.
what is essentially the same creature. So then, as I was making the game, being worried, oh my God, I'm going to have like 20 creatures in my game because and in each description, there's going to be like 10 names of the first sentence, you know.
Right.
It didn't happen because I've been working on this for a decade and it is a pan-European setting all the way from Ireland, as I say, to basically the Cossacus Mountains. There'll be about 100 or so distinctly unique fairies, fae, and magical creatures in this game. Many of which might have 6 or 7 names,
Uh-huh.
but it's still about 100 or so distinct, separate stat blocks and abilities, if you will.
Oh, okay. So it's not whether or not there differences in like, appearance or whatever, but the behavior is always going to be the same based on
Yeah.
the character
And,
setup.
yeah,
Okay.
and going back to what I was saying earlier about how appallingly terrible European folklore was at physical descriptions, when you come across your kobolds and your brownies and your Heinzenmecken, there's never any descriptions, especially for them because they're always invisible. But you know what I mean? It's like if there is a description, the description is essentially always the same anyway. And the behaviors, like it's the behaviors, behavior, pathology, and habitat would be the criteria by which I would be saying, okay, these are basically the same creature, just with different regional names, you know? They act in the same way, they interact with humans in the same way, they have a similar personality, whether that be kind, mischievous, or malevolent, and they are found in the same area in homes or in swamps or in forests.
Interesting. Now, you've also created some characters, right?
I did create 2 creatures for the game. And this was simply because when you are creating a game in which you have magical creatures that are based on the actual folklore, using strict D&D terms or gaming terms rather, you could have a single diminutive fairy TPK a party under level 5 under long without breaking a sweat because the Fae were so terrifyingly powerful in the stories. So I was like, well, shit, I need something to throw at a level 2 party, you know? So I came up with 2 types of, I described them as minor elemental creatures, rock gnomes and tree gnomes. And the rock gnomes are described as these small figures about 30 centimeters in height that look like they've basically been carved from rock with eyes of coal, and they're found in mines and caves and on the tops of like scree-covered rocky mountains. Okay, and sometimes they might interact with humans. Like if you have miners, if miners are exploring and then they end up tunneling into say an underground cave and there's a lot of rock gnomes there, well then they'll border that up and go the other way because they leave them alone. Okay, and
Yeah.
then the tree gnomes are literally like an arboreal fae. I describe them as looking like somebody has tried to carve a wizened old man from a piece of wood as a child's toy. So that's what they look like. Small figures again, often with like beards of moss, long claw-like fingers so that they can easily climb the trees. And they are very much like protectors of the forests. Um, and they will repair trees that are damaged in storms and that kind of stuff. But that was literally, they're the only 2 creatures that you will find in my game that are completely unique and are created by me. Every other creature in the game is not something that I've invented. It comes from folklore. And the only reason I created those 2 creatures, the 2 types of gnome, was purely for mechanical reasons because of how powerful they are. Another thing I did actually in designing the creatures was every creature in my game comes with 3 sets of stat blocks: young, adult, and ancient. Now, young doesn't mean child, it just means young. And by doing that, it meant that essentially, if you have a young version of the creature, they have some of the abilities that are found in the stories, An adult has more of the abilities, and an ancient creature will have all of the abilities that were described in the original folklore. Just yet again, it was purely a mechanical thing so that you can have fey and magical creatures the party are able to interact with at lower levels, that they actually have a chance of dealing, not being completely destroyed. Because like the reality is, you know, an ancient fey creature is, you know, sorry, you're not 16th level. Well, good luck.
Yeah, yeah.
You know.
Right.
So yeah, so I created two types of creatures in the game. Tree gnomes and rock gnomes, which are described as minor elemental creatures. Now I specifically created these creatures because when you have a game where all of the fey and magical creatures in your game are based on how they're described in folklore, well, that can create massive problems because a single diminutive fairy could TPK an entire party on their fifth level. So I decided I needed something that your players could interact with that they won't immediately get killed by. So I created the rock gnomes, which I described as being these short 30-ish centimeter creatures. They look like they're basically made of stone with like little cold black eyes, living in mines and caves, but also on the tops of like rocky, scree covered mountains. But sometimes miners might say be tunneling through and come upon a cave system, and there's a lot of rock gnomes in it. And if they find that, they wall that up, and then just go the opposite direction with their tunnel, And then the tree gnomes are arboreal fey creatures. They live in the forest. They look like somebody tried to make a child's toy that looks like a wizened, ugly old man. Um, Often with like long mossy beards and with long claw-like fingers, so they can and long claw-like toes, so they can easily climb the trees. And they protect the forest, and they will like repair trees that are damaged in storms and the likes. So that was it. They're the only two creatures in the entire game that I made up that are fictional. Every other fairy, magical creature in the system comes from folklore, comes from some original folklore from Europe. Okay. One thing I did do though was for all of the different creatures in the game, each one comes with three stat blocks: young, adult, and ancient. Now, young doesn't mean child, it just means younger. Okay. So a young version of the creature has some of the abilities described in the stories. An adult has more of the abilities, and then an ancient creature will have all of the abilities that are described in the original folklore, so that you can actually still have creatures in the game that your players can interact with, that where the power balance is better. It also is really fun because you have situations where the party face a fairy, let's say, okay? They face a fairy at fifth or sixth level, and it was a young fairy, and they handle it pretty well, and it's okay. And a couple of levels on, they find themselves facing another fairy thing. Oh, we had one of these guys before, it's grand. But the first fairy, the fairy they met was young. And this fairy is ancient and completely kicks their asses and wipes the floor in 2 rounds of combat. And that can be really
Right.
fun. That can be a real awakener for the party. I mean, one of these three forms,
Sure.
obviously been running this game for a long while. I've had actual players that I'm actually playing Twitch that finished there in the middle of January. And because it's my home game, most of the players are Irish, okay? A few friends might have emigrated to Ireland, okay? But growing up in Ireland, which is a country which has some of the most richly preserved folklore, not just in Europe but in the world, where I grew up with stories about fairies and fae, the Sheen and Dini Maw, and all of that. It's such an ingrained part of our culture. You gain a level of understanding and respect for fae and she that is missing in most other cultures, especially ones
Right.
on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean.
What
Yeah,
are you trying to say?
we all know what I'm saying. But it's funny because in our game, whenever my players were interacting with any fake creature, a great will be the elves. If they're interacting with an elf, and the elves in Fey Earth, they're like the elves of folklore, which means they're much more like the elves of Lord of the Rings than a standard D&D game. So they're basically demigods, okay? And they're all beautiful and stunning. But then if they come upon an elf and I describe that elf as looking like the equivalent of somebody, say, middle age in their 50s or 60s, my players instantly become terrified. Because if an elf looks that old, then they could be thousands of years old. Yeah,
Right. Oh,
yeah,
that's fascinating. And yeah, other people wouldn't
yeah.
necessarily know that. Okay, so let's talk about your upcoming project, The Hidden Folk
Yeah.
of the Feywild. Tell us a little bit about
Right.
that.
So when I created Fey Earth, originally the plan was because I was playing some Dungeons and Dragons at the time, was going to make a supplement, a module for D&D. But I pretty much as soon as I had that thought, realized this wouldn't work because so many of the creatures that I was going to be talking about from folklore, though the names of those creatures, though not the creatures themselves, already exist in Dungeons and Dragons. Your kobold, your goblin, your
Mhm.
elf. So I was like, okay, I'm going to be Pathfinder. No, same problem. So I very quickly realized, shit, like no matter what system I use, I will still run into the same problem that these names of these creatures have been used for decades in a way that never once tried to depict them accurately. So I was like, well, shit, I guess I have to make my own system then, which is what I did with Fair. I didn't completely reinvent the D20 system. It's really good. It's superior to other D20 systems. I'm just going to say that as a maths teacher who specializes in working with kids with, numeracy problems and difficulties with maths. I've created a beautifully simple game for people who find the maths hard. The maths of Fey Earth is not. But the reason I did it was because I knew I couldn't use an existing system because many of these names already appeared. But what I have done with Hidden Folk of the Feywild is this is a bestiary for fifth edition Dungeons and Dragons of about it's going to be somewhere between 70 and 80 creatures, obscure Fey and magical creatures from European folklore that essentially all appeared in my own game Fair that I'm now rewriting
Okay.
with stat blocks so you can use them in your game. So you can straight away take these, and if you're running a fifth edition Feywild campaign, if you're running 5e and you want to include more Fey in your game, this is the perfect
Mhm.
supplement for you. As I said, it's going to be 70 to 8 Fey creatures, and these, yet again, they all come from folklore. So when you read the descriptions and you look at their abilities, it just hits different because there's a level of realism and authenticity to them that you don't get often with other creatures that are just made up by people. I mean, they're amazing game designers. They're not
Right.
being disparaging to my peers in the design community, but it hits different. The way these creatures act and the abilities that they have are not the kinds of abilities that you normally find in more mainstream modern pop culture. Um, and that's what you will get with Hidden Folk of the Feywild. There are 3 creatures in my bestiary for which there is already creatures that use names in Dungeons and Dragons, but I chose to include them in my bestiary to highlight how massively different they were in the original folklore to how they're depicted. The 3 creatures that you will find in Hidden Folk of the Feywild, which you would also find in 5e, are the Banshee, the Goblin,
Mhm.
and the Tarask.
Mhm.
The 3 that you will find are based on, respectfully, Irish and Western French, English-ish folklore and French folklore.
Well, I don't think that that's such a big leap to have like more than one creature named in there that's wildly different. Because, if you think about like a Great Dane and a Chihuahua, right? They're both dogs, but, it's a whole different thing.
Absolutely, but they are wildly different. I mean, for example, the Banshee in 5e, a Banshee is an undead creature. Banshee is not undead. The word Banshee literally means fairy woman or elf woman. The word Ban in the
Hmm.
Irish language means woman, and the word she in Irish means fairy or elf. That's literally what the word means.
Hmm.
They were not undead. They were similar to the Black Shuck. They were harbingers of death. When you saw the Banshee and you heard their wail, a member of your family was going to die. They didn't kill them. They weren't evil. They were purely a messenger.
Hmm.
Likewise with the Goblin.
Hmm.
Goblins in original European folklore were not cowardly, snivelly, cave-dwelling, man-flesh eaters. They were extremely intelligent, highly cunning, highly mischievous, and extremely magical beings, exceptionally so, that could really mess you
Mhm.
up if they wanted to. And then you've got the Tarrasque.
Mhm.
You got the Tarrasque. I've always hated the Tarrasque in 5e. I thought it's the most stupid, messed up example of a kaiju on steroids you're ever going to come across. It's, I mean, for me as a GM, someone who's trying to tell a story to my friends, driven by narrative, I've always thought there was an awful idea for a creature. It's like, oh, it's this like world-ending thing that you're going to fight, and even if you kill it, it'll come. Like, what's the point, you know?
Yeah.
The Tarrasque originally comes from French folklore, and they weren't a massive like kaiju, nothing at all like that. They were about the size of an elephant, and they had this massive, dense, often depicted with spikes, turtle shell on their back,
Oh.
a large Neonian head, 6 legs, 3 pairs of legs ending in massive bear paws, and a long scorpion tail. And the other things that made them deadly was, apart from the fact that they were so massive they could swallow a man whole in a single bite, they also had an incredibly noxious, poisonous breath. Most people who faced the Tarrasque died before they even got near the creature because they were killed by its poisonous breath. And their shell
Huh.
was so dense that it was nearly impossible to injure them because it was such a heavy form of natural armor.
Mhm. And so when is that going to be coming out, and how are people going to be able to get it?
So the Kickstarter is launching on the 2nd of April. Okay. And you can
Okay.
find that on my socials, on Fey Earth, and also on Bramble Games. Bramble Games is basically a small little company I registered in Ireland a few years ago to publish Fey Earth. So that's what that is. Okay. I'm very, very, very active on Blue Sky under Fey Earth. That's where you can find all my stuff. So 2nd of April, the Kickstarter is launching. Please God, if we hit our funding goals, then the book itself will come out sometime by, I'm hoping, if the gods are smiling, at the latest February of next year.
Oh, okay.
I'm hoping to get it out a little bit sooner. Realistically, the earliest I can have it would be the December of this year, but I'm hoping February of next year.
Okay. And I can attest that Neil is very active on Blue Sky because that's where we met. All right. So where can people find your work in general? Where's the best place to go?
Well, I mean, me in general is in Blue Sky. I do have an itch.io page,
Mhm.
fey-earth.idch.io, and that's got some nice stuff on it. I have an early release beta version of my core rule book there called The Explorer's Guide to Fey Earth. It's like about 90% of the whole system, up to
Mhm.
10th level anyway. It's pretty much all the mechanics and everything you need to play to 10th level. Okay. So it's pretty solid, okay?
Uh-huh.
Including all of the magic and stuff that you get to that level and fun magic items. Oh, and also there's about 30 creatures at the end of that as well. So it does I
Hmm.
don't have all of the stat blocks for all of my creatures, but there's about 30 or so creatures stat blocks at the end of that, and it's a nice range of creatures as well,
Mhm.
from monstrous creatures to very intelligent creatures, from very physically large, imposing to highly magical. So you got a nice mix of stuff that you can throw at your players. I also on my itch.io page have a really, really fun starter adventure, Trouble in the North, which is set in the village of Hawes in Yorkshire. This is a real village in Yorkshire, and it is for a party of players from levels 1 to 5. So thinking of it as my Minds of Fandelver with a less stupid name. And so that's a really, really fun game. As I said, it really gives you a sense of what the world of Faith is about. Okay.
Mhm.
I've also got a bunch of other stuff on there as well. A couple of one shots that I've released and a couple of other games. Last year, I published another really, really fun, small little game called Fey Wanderer. I decided I wanted to make a game for when it's game night, but half of the players have to cancel and the other half still want to play something. And so I created this game, Fey Wanderer, where you basically play a party of fey creatures on a quest for a treasure in the Fey realm.
Mm.
And I created this wonderfully simple rules-like game, which literally you need 15 minutes of prep. Everybody, within 15 minutes, you have made your player characters, and your GM has an adventure ready to play right there and then.
Nice.
Use a really fun simple dice pool system, and a really fun open magic system where you learn words of power and spheres of magic. So you say, I want to use this word with this type of magic to create this effect. And then it's just a case of you describing what you're doing and then rolling. Okay. And then it was funny because I didn't plan this, but I inadvertently, in making this game, made a game which you can buy it on the miniature page for like €8, dollars. I can't remember what currency it shows in. But anyway, it is a game that is perfect for introducing kids to tabletop role-playing games.
Oh, nice.
And they're actually better at it than the adults because kids' imaginations are so much better than an adult's imagination.
Of course.
And I even included notes in the game for how you can tweak the rules if you're playing with kids who are pre-numerate. So if you have very small children who are pre-numerate, how you can, using simple little tweaks of the game, still have them fully engaged in and playing the game properly.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, so really, really fun, really whimsical game that I would recommend to everybody. And like, it's great for a fun night out, you know? So that's what I mean.
Okay. And just in case y'all are wondering, if you go to Blue Sky, you don't go to Neil's name, you look for Fey Earth.
Yeah, I don't even think I have a personal Blue Sky. No, I don't have a personal Blue Sky account. So it's this.
Yeah, and it's F-E-Y.
Yes, F-E-Y. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with listeners before we say goodbye?
Back my Kickstarter.
Yes, indeed.
No, seriously, back my Kickstarter. The creatures in it are incredible. They're amazing. Like, it was really funny because it was actually, I'm still working on it. It's very challenging for me because obviously these are all creatures that I wrote for my own game, Fey Earth. And the system that I designed is a system that was designed to allow me to give abilities to reflecting how their ability to describe their stories. But then for this work here for Hidden Folk of the Feywild, I was then trying to transfer those stats across. The physical stats was fairly easy, but the real challenge was the magical abilities. Trying to find spells in 5th edition that map onto the magical abilities of these fey creatures was incredibly challenging because they don't quite fit a lot of the time, you know?
Yeah.
And also what was really interesting is looking at things like CR ratings and mechanics. So quite a lot of creatures in Hidden Folk of the Feywild can cast at will as many times a day as they want the spell Greater Invisibility.
Whoa.
Yeah, because that was the norm in stories from folklore, was that many creatures would be invisible at all times. And if they were using magic or doing other stuff, their invisibility didn't break. They stayed invisible. So stuff like that, it was really surprising for me when I read it, because like I didn't think about it. But then putting it into 5e, you rethink about like mechanics of this, because I know how big the deal. I mean, it seems like a minor thing, but for those who aren't familiar with it, Greater Invisibility, the classic invisibility spell, as soon as you attack or cast a spell, the invisibility breaks. Whereas with Greater Invisibility, that doesn't happen. You attack or cast a spell, you're still invisible.
Wow, that's amazing. And when you think back to some of these original stories, like that's the scary stuff. It happens at night when you can't see, so invisibility would, of course, be terrifying, because how do you defend against that?
I mean, there are certain spells in 5e that you can take to see invisible creatures. Stuff like, what's the fairy fire and stuff like that.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time. I am so excited about your Kickstarter. I can't wait for that. It was great to hear about Fey Earth and about that universe that you've created. So I really appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you very much for having me on.
As always, thanks for listening to Folkloring. If you liked what you heard, please consider leaving a rating and review. And don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. If you have any questions or comments, or would like to suggest a topic for a future episode, please email us at folkloringpod@gmail.com or message us on Facebook or Instagram. Other places you can find me are at the Folklore Podcast as the theater, film, and storytellers correspondent, or creating folklore-inspired games at madmenandheroes.com. Stay curious, stay connected, and keep the traditions alive. And I hope that wherever you are, folklore is making your life more magical.